This is the video for the Earthwork Pro plugin, also for the Earthwork Pro metric plugin. First thing when setting up this plugin, we need to begin by setting the proper scale for our page. So zooming in here, we're going to be looking at the page scale. Here it says 1 inch is equal to 50 feet. We can set that scale here from our drop down menu, 1 inch equals 50 feet. And when we get our disclaimer, we need to double check that the scale is set correctly. So we'll click agree and choose the dimension tool to check the scale. Now this scale shows 150 just past the line, so it's really off by maybe a few inches. I can go ahead and redo the scale by typing in the dimension needed. So I'm going to go to my scale button, click the upper portion of the button, and clear the scale off of the page. You will notice that this marker, this indicator here on each page, that will go ahead and clear out the scale. So now we want to go ahead and set the scale equal to this dimension from 0 to 150. And we'll begin by clicking scale again. We'll type 150 and click OK. Now the computer asks me, or the program asks me, to click the first point of the dimension for scaling. Now if I press and hold down M on the keyboard, I can magnify and zoom in to the center point of the line, and this will make my scale more accurate. However, it's only going to scale this in the x-axis. I also need the y-axis set to scale. So the way we can do this, if we don't have a dimension going vertically, we can take the dimension line we just used, click on it to select it, and then I will go to my other tab and click rotate to the left to rotate that dimension line. Then I can now use my own dimension line to scale this page vertically. So I'll go back to my scale button, I'll click that, and I'll type in 150 again and click OK. Now to get it exactly to the distance I've already set this dimension, I'm going to click the snap button. It's down on the bottom toolbar of PlanSwift. There's a black toolbar. When I click snap, I get a red box that snaps to points that I've already set up, and that will set my dimension in the X and Y axis, and you can see that by that marker here on this page. You always need to make sure your pages are set to have both X and Y axis. And by default, when you use the automatic scale or the drop down scale here, it does automatically scale in both the X and Y axis. However, it is critical to note that when you use this drop down scale, you do need to double check dimensions to make sure your scale is set properly. Once you know your scale is set properly, then you can begin. So I'm going to go to our area of interest. For this demo, we're going to be talking about lots 23 through 33. This is what we'd like to analyze. And basically, we need to take a look at the existing contours and then the proposed contours. Now, Earthwork Pro for PlanSwift is much different than other programs that are out there. PlanSwift is really a two-dimensional program, and we use two-dimensional tools, but we're going to add in a third dimension by assigning each area of interest and elevation. So on the right hand side of PlanSwift, you'll have a drop down menu, and after you've installed the Earthwork Pro plugin, you'll see this Earthwork Pro option. Same for Earthwork Pro metric. And when we click that option here, there's 3 folders. The first folder has random colors of these 2 templates, existing and proposed, with just a generic 100 elevation there. I personally prefer to use pre-shaded coloring, and it will assign a color of brown for existing or blue for proposed. Now the numbers 1 through 6, this just means there's 6 values of shaded brown. These numbers are just really placeholders for each shade, and you can use them over and over. All of these are essentially the same template with just a slightly different color. So if I use 1 through 6 and I need to do another one, or a 7th or 8th, just cycle back through the numbers. And let me explain how we would use one of these templates. So looking at my site plan, I see that I have an elevation of 312, and the next existing elevation is 314 right here. The area between those two is what we're going to be analyzing. So the average elevation of the area between these two contours is 313. Again, I'm taking the average between the contours. So I'll click my green button here on the right. This is my record button, and that will actually pop up my template. And I'm going to hit my tab key and tab to the next box. I don't need to really change the name. And I'm going to set the elevation here to 313. Then I'm also going to just put it into a folder. I just created a folder called Digitizing. You can create one that would just be Earthwork Pro, or whatever you like. And then we'll click OK. And that turns on my Digitize Record button. And now I'll go ahead and digitize this area. Now I really only need to digitize just outside of each of these lots, because that's my area of interest. So I'll start there, and I'm going to work my way around this contour. I'm going to disable snap really quickly down at the bottom, but I will come back and turn snap on again, and I'll show you that in just a moment. And then once I go back outside the lots, I can cross over to contour 312 and come and follow contour 312, and I'm again just filling in the area between both of those existing contours to set this area of interest, or this average area, at 313. I'll right click and hit stop, and I've recorded that area. There's roughly 6,100 square feet, and I've assigned the elevation of all that square footage at 313 feet in elevation. That's actually where we're going to generate our third coordinate in the X, Y, and Z. So next I would want to do the next contour, which would be 315, because that's the average of 314 and the average of 316. So I'll go to my existing contour template, and I'll just choose number 2, that's a different color brown. Click the green button again. I'll tab down to 315, typing that in, leaving it in the folder I created, and click OK. Now here's where I want to turn on my snap tool. It's down here at the bottom of PlanSwift. One thing to note in your settings for snapping, if you go to snapping, when you enable snapping, you want to disable hover snap to axis. So go ahead, uncheck that in snapping, and now that I've got this enabled, you'll see down here my snap is lit up. That means the button is on. So when I hover over any point that I've already created, it can snap to that point. And I'll just begin by going along elevation 314 again, and I'm just snapping to the points that I've already set up. Now if it snaps to some points I don't intend to snap it to, go ahead and hit backspace on the keyboard. Backspace can undo and get you to reposition the point as needed. So again, that's the backspace button. I get over here now, I may want to turn off snap again. I can do that by simply pressing F3 on the keyboard. F3 is the shortcut key for enabling or disabling snap. And then again, I'm following up to elevation 316 right now to finish out this contour. And we get outside the area of interest again, and I'll right click and hit stop. So after doing all of this for all of these existing contours, what we'd ultimately end up with, let me show you a different view, would look like this. As we fill these in, again starting from 313, we'd have that contour, and you'll notice on 313 this contour went up and came back across lot 33. So one of the things that I may need to do would be, once I've put in this 313, would be to create a new section of that, and I can right click anytime on that section and just choose the option new section from here from my right click menu, and I can come back and continue to digitize to create that new section here. Okay, so again, we had so far 313, then 315, then 317, and then we had 319, 321, 311, and 309. And all of those existing contours basically created this blanket of area through my entire site of interest, lots 23 through 33. The next thing we would do would be to create another section of the lots or the proposed areas themselves. Now, on certain plans, you're going to have just spot points or point elevations or spot elevations for your proposed. Maybe it would be the top of curb, or it would be a foundation. Ultimately, you just have to kind of create where those contours would be for your proposed. Now, in this particular example, I used each lot and assigned each lot an elevation. So you can see when we go in and turn on these layers, each lot itself had an elevation, and we assign that lot a specific elevation going across the board. Okay. Now, ultimately, where these lots for my proposed overlap my existing, that creates an area of interest. What will be analyzed is wherever these two different types overlap each other. So wherever I have proposed overlapping existing, that's where we're going to calculate our totals. So now moving on, we're just going to go to another view real quick, and we're going to select the area for calculations. Now, what I actually like to do is hit my zoom to fit button, which will show me the entire page, and then I can come to the top left corner of the page and left click and drag this light blue box, which will select everything. The reason I do this is I want to make sure to select all of my areas, so we can see that they are all selected here. And then once I know I have everything selected, both existing and proposed, I'm going to click Earthwork Pro. Selecting Earthwork Pro pops up this little window here for the tool. Now, you have a range of calculation sizes. You can go from as small as 3 square inches to 2 square feet, or 24 by 24 inches. For a site like this, I'm going to choose 12 by 12 inches. I'm going to analyze the entire site with an invisible grid. So at every single square foot, it's going to calculate the difference between existing and proposed and give me a volume. And once I get those volumes, it's going to also sort out which ones are cut and which ones are fill, and then give me a total of cuts and fills at the end of the calculations. So that's your calculation size. You would want to use different ranges. Maybe for a fast food chain on a corner lot that's smaller than half an acre, you could use 3 inch by 3 inch. But anything that's several acres large, you'd want to go up in size. And so for now, we'll just go ahead and use 1 square foot. For graphics, if you want to show graphics, you must check this box. And then same thing, you have a different range in sizes. We're going to use a graphic size here of 10 feet by 10 feet. And we're just going to leave the graphics option here set to closed. And then I'll go ahead and click calculate. Now it's going to run the calculations. It only takes here just a few moments. And now it's going to add the graphics. The graphics, you can see, are kind of filling in these squares. Red squares would mean that there's a cut. Blue squares would mean there's a fill. And the size of each square in this particular case is 10 feet by 10 feet. And we can make them a little smaller, but PlanSwift's memory can't hold all the calculations and the graphics. It's too much for it to bear. So you'll notice now everywhere where I've got this red in my area of interest, this would be where we're going to have to cut. So our existing would be too high. Everywhere where we've got blue, we're going to have to fill. So our existing would be too low. And this just gives you a good idea of where you're high or low. You'll also notice it adds in a value here This 261, that's how many white points there are. Okay, we're basically just using a square point count tool to generate these graphics. So that 261 does not mean how many yards of cut. This again does not mean how many yards of cut. Neither does this 112 mean how many yards of fill. What this actually means is there's 112 points here in the graphics. Where we're going to go to find our values as far as cubic yards and how much actual volume we have, we're going to click on reports. And we're going to go to a report here on your report layouts. There's a report called Contour Breakout. This is where we actually see our cubic yards in total. So for each different contour, for contours 317, we have 898 cubic yards of cut. That value is in my cut column. The only contour that actually had both cut and fill was contour 315. It had 310 yards of cut and 132 yards of fill for a net total of 178 of cut. So essentially my grand totals, you'd find them down here at the bottom. I have 3,100 yards of cut total and 1,018 cubic yards of fill total for a net total of minus 2,085. Basically, I'm taking my fills from my cuts or my cuts from my fills. So if you ever have a negative number here, that means you had more cut than fill. If it's a positive number, you'll have more fill than cut. And so again, this number would be what I would need to export from this site if this was what I was excavating for these lots. You can also go to your estimating tab in PlanSwift and you'll have a folder in here called Earthwork Controls. The reason this will exist is, suppose that I need to actually modify all of my numbers by a factor of 10% for expansion or shrinkage. Either way, you can go to your right click and go to your properties, and that will open this Earthwork Controls properties, and you can adjust your totals by a certain percentage. So if I want to adjust all my cuts by 10%, I can select this option, click OK, and you'll notice all the cuts were adjusted. It also affected my report, and my report now was affected by about 300 yards, almost 400 yards total here, 3,400, and now I have a net total of 2,396. So again, going to the estimating, you can right click on Earthwork Controls, go to Properties, and adjust your values here as a percentage if you need to make adjustments for expansion or contraction or any swell factors that you may use. And then I can set those back to 0, and these would be my bank cubic yards. Just a couple of other things that I want to mention for Earthwork Pro. If you're using the Earthwork Pro metric, you need to make sure in your settings that you go to the General option and set your default units to M for just meters. You want just your default units to be set to meters. You also need to, when you're creating a new project, you need to make sure you set your measurement type to metric. Again, this is if you're using Earthwork Pro metric. So you need to have your default units set to meters and make sure you set your measurement type at the beginning of the project to metric. That being said, basically if we look at the numbers again, let's say we wanted to analyze this again and do it on a more precise level, or let's say we want to look at the difference between how our cubic yards would come out if we calculated at 2 by 2 instead of every square foot. I'll just show you that here really quickly. So we're going to reselect it. We're going to click Earthwork Pro again. We're going to change our calculation size. And this time I'm also going to show what the graphics would look like if you choose this option for open graphics. It's basically going to just put in kind of a grid instead of a box. So we'll go ahead and click Calculate, run our calculations, and then we're going to now add the graphics here, and it puts in more of a grid instead of a box. But again, it will still show red for cut and blue for fill. And it's again a personal preference if you want to show one type of graphic versus the other. both of these are basically set on a grid of 10 feet by 10 feet. We'll get a glimpse of that here in just a moment. But again, anything that you choose for graphics has no bearing on the actual calculation. And so this is what it looks like using the grid versus completely filling it in with closed graphics. So again, it's a personal preference. This is what the closed graphics looks like. This is the open graphics kind of as a grid. Now let's go look at the difference in our calculations. These top numbers here, 794 is what we calculated at 1 foot squares. 791 is what we calculated at 2 foot squares. 1098 and 1101. So really the differences are only just a few yards for each one that you scale it to. But again, as we drop that grid, we're going to get more accuracy. But again, you also want to balance when you're talking about these calculation sizes. You want to balance what your computer's memory can handle. So if your memory starts to bog down on too small of a calculation, you can cancel that and go to a bigger calculation and it will run just fine, and you really won't get any difference in your, well, you do get a difference, but you can see just a few yards, 3 cubic yards here and a couple cubic yards here is really not going to make or break your bid when you're talking about thousands of cubic yards ultimately. That's everything for the Earthwork Pro plugin. If you have any other questions, you can contact me through the plugin store here. You've got the plugin store. If you go to Earthwork Pro and look at the details, my name is Aaron Watts. This is my contact information. Hopefully you can see the value in this plugin for PlanSwift and enjoy it. Anyway, that will be everything. And that's the end of the demo.